Hi there, everybody. Welcome to Book Club Babble's Authors Cut Live. I'm Tabitha Lord, one of the senior writers for BCB, and I'm here tonight with Lynda, the author of Two Family House. And this was one of my very favorite books that I read last year. I actually got to interview Lynda for our blog back then, and I was very excited to bring her book to my real book clubs, both of them, and then to put it on our book club live, and now to have her as an author tonight on Authors Cut. So just a couple of housekeeping items before Lynda introduces herself more thoroughly. If you are joining us tonight on the webcam, we can see each other, but we cannot see or hear you. So if you would like to communicate with me, if you hover your mouse or your pad over the bottom of your screen, you can click on the chat function. You can send me a question and I can give it to Lynda to answer during the course of our interview and our conversation tonight. So that's how we'll be communicating. The other thing is that if you have a phone or a tablet that you're using this evening, if you touch the screen, it should bring up those functions and you should be able to chat with us that way. We are streaming now live on Facebook and on YouTube, and this interview will be posted to Book Club Babble's website when we're complete this evening. So welcome, Lynda. It's so great to have you tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's so exciting.
I know, right? It's kind of fun to be able to chat.
Fun.
What I wanted to do is let you have a moment to just introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, and particularly, I know that you are married and you have two kids, and I know that you live in New York, and I also know that you have a law degree. And so I'm just super interested in hearing how you got from that to writer.
Yeah.
But anything else you want to share is fine too.
Sure. So I grew up in Massachusetts, actually. I never thought I would be a New Yorker or live in New York. But I went to law school in New York. So I moved there for that. And then I ended up staying. And I met my husband. And I was a trust and estates lawyer, actually, for 10 years. And I never really loved being a lawyer. But I have to say, if you're the type of person who really should be a writer, or you're a storyteller, or a person who just ruminates on other people's stories, being a trust and estates lawyer is probably the best kind to be, because it's actually, it's like family drama, and that's what it is. That's what it is. So my very first job as a lawyer, I rotated through a trust and estates department. It was like 3 rotations, and that was my favorite by far and away, because my very first assignment was this man, this very lovely partner, sat me down and told me this story. And it was all about his client, who was this very wealthy, shipping magnate. And he had a wife who was, off in Switzerland, and all these affairs and all of these illegitimate children. The legal issues were just legal issues. And I didn't really like those, but I liked the story. That was when I probably should have quit being a lawyer. I probably should have stopped way back then, but I did it for 10 years. And I met my husband. He's a lawyer too. And we have 2 kids, and we have 1 girl and 1 boy, which is interesting if you've read the book, because, the book has a lot of issues about gender and what people want in terms of the children that they have. So I feel very lucky, actually, that I have 1 of each, because, it's just a little smorgasbord of people in my house. So, I guess that's it. That's me. I don't live in the city anymore. I live up in Westchester County, an hour north of the city. And I don't practice anymore. And now I get to chat with you, which is much better than being a lawyer.
And write books and blogs and interviews and such. So yeah. I'm going to assume that most of the people that are logged on with us tonight have read your book. But those who may click later or watch the interview later or just stumble upon us somehow in the course of the evening may not have, and I so want to entice them to read it because it's so good. And there's so much to talk about, and it's such a perfect book club book. So I'm just going to read the little introduction I wrote for you on our blog last time that we did it to sort of set the stage, and then we can get into some of the meat of the story.
Great.
Lynda Cohen Loigman crafts a beautifully complex and deeply satisfying story with her debut novel, The Two Family House. Sisters by marriage, but friends by choice, Helen and Rose share a 2-family house in Brooklyn, where with their husbands they raise their children. But one snowy winter night, the 2 mothers give birth at the same time and make a decision that will forever alter their lives. With warmth and sensitivity, Lynda explores the challenges of motherhood and marriage, the effects of deeply ingrained gender biases, and the unintended repercussions of a long-held family secret. A compelling and superbly written novel, The Two-Family House is sure to be a book club favorite. So I just wanted, well, I really mean it. I just wanted to set the stage for, those people that are here, and maybe that will, like I said, those will stumble upon us and be enticed by the book. So if we can just dive in a little bit, I wanted to chat a minute about filial expectations, and that we had a book club, online book club Facebook chat going for a couple weeks leading up to this. And so I thought I'd, kind of bring some of those questions in our discussion threads into this conversation now. And one of them was on what are our expectations, our gender expectations about our children and our families, and things that are sort of put on us from the outside world. And then maybe how did that influence your writing? So for example, I know I wanted to have boys. When I thought about having babies, I just wanted sons. And I thought I'm just better with noise and dirt and being outside and baseball fields and everything else. And that in and of itself is such a gender biased perception of raising a boy. And so, but I ended up having 3 boys. And then by my 4th child, that I knew was going to be my last, I desperately wanted a girl. And my mother would say, you need a little girl. No one is going to take care of you when you're old or communicate with you. And there's these really still strongly held sort of gender biased filial expectation things. And that was a great thread that we had going on Facebook. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how that sort of thing still lives and how that maybe influenced your story.
Yeah. Well, so when I was growing up, the book is based, the setting of the book is based on my mother's childhood home, because my mother did grow up in Brooklyn in a 2-family house, and she was one of 3 girls. And my grandmother, when I was young, my mother was the oldest of those 3 girls, and my brother was the first grandchild, and he was a boy. And my grandmother always wanted a boy, and she doted on him, and she would very openly, she had no filter. She would say, he is my favorite. I always wanted a boy. And she would say it to me, right? Which was a little bit crazy. And when I was little, it used to bother me. As I got older and I had an adult relationship with my grandmother, and our relationship was so close, I started to understand more of what she meant when she said that. It was kind of like she liked to cook. She wanted a boy to eat a lot of food. She wanted, and that is a bias, right? She wanted, boys to stream into her kitchen and just eat everything that she had, and not young girls who would worry about, fitting into something that they were wearing, or, not just picking at her food. She wanted someone strong like that. Unfortunately, she didn't have a great marriage. And I think that she was looking for that kind of role of a man who would be caring and loving. And she had this really special relationship with my brother, actually. My brother's a psychiatrist, and she would lie down on the couch and tell him her problems. But, she had very strong feelings about it. And when I was pregnant, it's funny, you say that you wanted to have boys. And with my first child, I really wanted a girl. And part of why I think I wanted a girl was not even, it had to do a little bit with kind of this joke that my grandmother and I had running. She would always say to me that she wanted a boy, so I would say to her that I wanted a girl. And we had this back and forth, and she would get so angry at me, and I would kind of goad her on, because she would say, of course, when it came to my child, and she believed this too, she would say, as long as it's healthy, why would you even say that? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It should only be healthy. But I do think we have these very strong expectations. And for me, it extended even to my daughter. When she was 3 and I was pregnant with our second child, for whatever reason, all of our friends at the time were pregnant. We moved to the suburbs. We went to a preschool. I became friendly with all these moms, and we were all pregnant at the same time. And they were all having girls, and all of her friends had little sisters. And she desperately wanted a little sister, because that was sweet. And that was someone she could play with, and she could, do all those dress up things with. And she had these very strong expectations about what she wanted. And I felt, and we had a boy, and we actually found out with our second that we were going to have a boy. And when we told her, it was no.
Right.
And I felt like I had a little bit of a glass house problem. Like I had wanted a girl. So why did I think it was so wrong for her to want a girl?
Right.
These things, they're very hard to get rid of. And actually an article kind of about those desires was what spurred the story, what inspired me to write the story, which we can talk more about later. But I think that gender expectations they're very personal. You wanted a boy, I wanted a girl, people want different things, but they're there.
Yeah.
It's hard to get away from them.
It is hard to get away from them. And it's hard to even say that they're really wrong in a way. I mean, when I had my fourth child, I wanted the experience of raising a girl. I had the experience of raising 3 boys, and it was wonderful. But I wanted, I'm here doing this mom thing. It would be really neat to see what would a little girl bring to our family, and what would, how would it be different, and how would it be the same? And were our expectation, would she be the one that wanted to play with the trucks and throw the baseball around and and would it shatter all of and honestly, I didn't really care, but I cared enough that I found out what she was going to be, because I thought I have to be prepared. If I'm going to be the mother of only boys, I have to know, I have to know and be okay with that. And if it's going to be a girl, we have to think, all right, our world's going to look a little different,
Yeah.
So it's just, I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily, but it is something to, we pay attention to in a different way now, I think, and question where the root of it comes from, Okay, so a question popped up on my screen, and it says, your kids might not like this question, but do you respond to them differently because of their gender? And what about your husband? And
it's funny. I don't, it's kind of a vague, like, to what I respond differently. I actually think birth order plays a much bigger role in like development and sort of like where we all fit into the family more than gender. But we do, do I respond to, this is a very difficult question.
I know, right? And it says all panelists. I'm like, well,
yeah.
So you go first.
They're different. I think that I respond differently to them because they're different. I don't think that I respond differently to them because one's a boy and one's a girl. In fact, like my daughter was a much kind of like more, she wasn't colicky, but she was a more difficult baby, to put to sleep. And my son was so easy, he was a much easier baby to I don't know, to just like put to sleep and take care of when he was little. He was just really so easygoing. And she was a more high-strung baby, maybe because I was a more high-strung mother with my first than with my second, So I don't think it's because of gender that I treat them differently. I think it's just that they're different, but I don't know.
I know, it's funny because my older 2 boys, my oldest son is probably one of the most sensitive members of the family. He's super intuitive. He's super like, he's the one who remembers, oh, Mom, remember that day? And you were really sad about this. And we talked, and my other one will be like, yeah, I remember you were wearing a blue shirt, and they're just 2 different people.
Yeah.
And my third, same thing. But, I do find my husband is a little gentler with my daughter. Like he can't bear to see her cry.
Right. That's yeah.
And that's definitely a gender thing.
Right.
He doesn't raise his voice in the same way, but there's also this, the young lion cub becoming and going up again and just trying to find their way. I don't know. It's very animalistic almost, but not in a bad way.
Yeah. I mean, my husband really tries. My daughter's the older one and she's 18 now, and they're so busy. She's a senior in high school. She's so busy. And we definitely do that like divide and conquer thing on the weekends sometimes, not as much now because she can drive herself. But when they were younger, he would always, it wasn't like he always took my son, we would switch back and forth because he wanted to separate and to go get them to this activity and that activity. So, but we only had 2, see, you have 4. And you had 3 boys. So like, and if the youngest is a girl, then that makes sense to me that your husband would be different, because it's a big change after 3 boys.
And the boys were so excited to have a little girl. I mean, they dressed her up. I mean, it wasn't me, it was them. They were getting her all, and prancing her around and just, but it also was, she was the last baby too. So it's hard to know what what's gender, what's birth order, like you said.
Right. Yeah.
So there's another question here, which is interesting, and then I'll move on to one of mine, is, did your grandmother read the book? And if she did.
Grandmother, yeah. Sadly, she passed away before the book. Yeah, so it would have been really terrific if she could have read the book.
Right.
But I did, she was around for, when my children were little. But she passed away about 5 years ago now. So she, she never read the book. I did try, and she was ill when I was like starting to write it and stuff. So there were some things that I would kind of ask her, but she was a big inspiration for a lot of it. So I like to think that she knows about it. And actually it's I write a little bit about her in the acknowledgments. So
nice. All right. So characters in the story. You just do an amazing job of developing these characters, and they, I would say Helen is one who sort of stays true to who you introduced us to her. She's who she is. She's this warm, engaging, sort of the, stable, steadfast, and she's just lovable, and you love her the whole way through. And then we have Rose, the sister-in-law, who is a very sympathetic character in the beginning, and then slowly becomes somebody that you almost are just like, okay, Rose, time for you to go now, and becomes really unsympathetic. And her husband Mort, one of the reasons she was a sympathetic character was because he was such kind of cold, he was judgmental, he was all these things, and you sort of felt for her living in this marriage, and they almost reversed roles. The readers, sympathies switched almost, and you saw Mort soften over time, and you saw Rose harden and become more challenging. And so I wonder, did you start with the seed of a character, and then they told you how they were, through the course of the story, what was going to happen? Or did you sort of say, all right, this is the character that's going to have this kind of an arc, and go with it that way? How did you sort of create these amazing?
Yeah, well, I thought about this book for such a long time. It was in my head for so many years, because the idea for it came to me when my daughter was a baby. And so those 4 adult characters, they were like living with me for, like 17 years. So I had a lot of time to really ruminate on them. Right. And they developed these very distinct like personalities and voices in my head. So I did know before I ever sat down to write, I knew that Mort was going to have this transformation. Rose, I knew that it was going to break her, that what happened was going to really kind of break her in this terrible way, and that she would have this postpartum depression that would, go beyond and be exacerbated and amplified by everything that happened. I didn't know when I started just how dark she would get. I mean, I thought I did, but when I actually went to write it, some of the things that came out of her mouth that, some of those things were maybe even more bitter than I originally thought that they would be. And she is dark. I mean, she is a very unhappy, she becomes very, very unhappy, and she can't, she can't feel joy anymore, really. It just destroys her. So,
yeah.
And, then you have Abe, who Abe I love, but the people who change and the people who grow for better or for worse are really the most interesting ones.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, Helen was interesting to write also. Yeah. But Abe, Abe is kind of in many ways like the least interesting character in the story, but he was always going to be that way. He was always going to be, we all know an Abe. Everybody has an Abe.
Right. The steadfast just stays, right. You can count on. They are going to always be. Yeah. Right. You do need them. You need them in the world, but it doesn't make for such an interesting story if they all 4 were.
But you need somebody. I felt like I needed somebody like that in this story, this house. Yeah.
Okay, so I have another question that's popped up, and it's related to characters, so I'll give it to you now. And it said, in the book, Mort is embittered because he didn't have a boy, and that, that's the premise that you set it up. And he seemed worried about not having a legacy without one. And do you think Mort's concern with the children, with having a boy, is an issue of his time? Is he a product of the time and the situation, or is it just his, his personality? In your mind, was he?
In my mind, he's a product of his generation, very much so, and even the way that he changes over the course of the book, those were changing times. We go, from the 40s to the 60s, and of course, ideas about education for young women, those things change. So I do feel like he is a product of his time period.
And that brings me to Judith, one of my favorite little smaller characters in the, in the story. And she really wanted an education. She wanted to stretch beyond the convention. And like you said, the times were changing. And I think part of Mort's relationship with Judith was sort of drew him forward, in time and in evolution, so to speak. So can you talk a little bit about her character? And I think I'd asked you once before who was one of your favorites, or who do you relate to most? And I think you said Judith. So
I mean, well, it's interesting because when I first started writing, I never intended to use the voices of Judith or Natalie. So, the book alternates from these 6 different perspectives, and the 4 main adults are, the main characters. And then you have the oldest girl of Mort and Rose, and then Natalie, one of the babies that was born that night. But I didn't go in thinking I was going to explore them as much. And what happened was, when I went to write the chapter where the babies are born, I had a problem because I couldn't write it from one of the perspectives of the men, and I didn't really want to choose one of the women to write it from, because it just seemed wrong to pick one of them, to give one of them that power. And I didn't want to write it twice because I didn't want to belabor it and keep, knocking you over the head with it. So the idea of, I tried it bringing back the midwife from the prologue, and that didn't work. And then I thought, let me do it from the perspective of the oldest daughter, because she would be the one most likely to be there. And that was that innocent perspective. And once I started writing from Judith's perspective, I liked it so much. It was so much fun. And there was just something about her that drew me in. And part of it, I guess, is because, I thought it made me think about how I was at that age. She has a little bit of me in her. She has a little bit of my mother in her. She has all those different aspects, and she doesn't make a fuss, she has disappointments, but she just carries on. I like that about her. She just kind of pushes forward. And I think that's something that people don't do as much today, but people were better at kind of dealing with their lot in life then, I think. Right. And she does that. And I just like how steady she is.
She has a grace about her, as a character, and a strength. And it's really, she's a minor character in a way, but she takes up a lot of space in the story in terms of her being able to create something different. She's a witness, and she's sort of a revolutionary in her own quiet way. And I loved her. She was great. So let's see, I have a comment here, and it says, when Rose is pregnant and nibbling on Helen's bread, you say something like, the bread was like dust in her mouth. And I thought that was brilliant, because soon after that, her words were brittle and dry, and she just seemed to shrivel up after that. So compliment to your writing skills. But I found your imagery, just to be beautiful. I mean, it's a character-driven, story, and the characters are moving the plot along, but it's their essence, and through your words. So that's lovely. So I will share that with you.
Thank you.
So one of the other things that the characters have to deal with is loss in this book. And there's, 2 instances, well, there's more, but 2 big instances of loss, of death. And I was thinking about the fact that they lived in such community. They had their tribe around them, these 2 families living in the 2-family house. And then you juxtapose that and created this tension with having boundaries, right? And crossing boundaries. And so for Helen, she almost weathers the storms of these, losses and this, the natural devastation of life, I would call it. But, she weathers it because her tribe was her most important thing. And she sort of lives with that. Whereas Rose created the boundaries, stepped out, pushed away, and she never really recovers. And I just thought it was an interesting, different kind of dynamic tension. And I was thinking about that as I was, rereading and going over it, that it was really a very interesting concept, because we don't live in community like that very much anymore, where we have our extended family around us, yet we somehow try to create a tribe, of our girlfriends, our book club girls, our, whatever we do. I've had my sister live with me for years, but it's not the norm to think in tribe, like having your tribe around you. And Rose was sort of pushing away from that. And in the end, it felt like she was the one who lost the most, even though you sort of were like done with her by the end and like, goodbye, Rose. But, that was sort of tragic in its way. And I thought it was interesting. And was that a purposeful, like you were clearly working with those themes in this.
Yeah.
If you want to talk a little bit about
that. I think the boundaries is a big thing too, what you're saying. And she's humiliated. There's such a wonderful thing about that kind of closeness, but then there's also the flip side, which is the lack of privacy and kind of, how awful do we feel today if, you're with your kids, you have a bad parenting moment and it's public, right? Like you lose it. Right, you have a young child, and you're in the grocery store and they're having a fit, and you want to rise above and be that wonderful mother, and yet something, you say something you shouldn't say, you scream, you scowl, you do whatever, and then someone looks at you and sees you and you're humiliated. And in that house, Rose feels that humiliation, that day when Helen comes down and she finds, for just neglecting this baby, he's in his crib and he's crying and he's soaked through his diaper and every horrible, it's humiliating. And that's what spurs her. It's interesting because it's kind of like that humiliation that even gives her the drive to sort of push past her postpartum depression, sort of become a little bit more capable, just so she doesn't have to deal with Helen as much, Right. But she is the one. It's interesting when you say she's the one who loses the most, because she is, but it's, she's like in a prison of her own making. At first she's so put upon and she's so meek, and her husband has just run roughshod over her for all these years. And then when she gives him this son, there's this subtle shift in power, and then it becomes not so subtle, and he notices it. And she just has that epiphany where she says, it's all been a test and it doesn't matter what I do. And that awful moment where she realizes what she did this unthinkable thing, made this unthinkable choice in order to please him, in order to pass a test. And really it didn't even matter, because he can become close to a girl. He can, and that is what drives her. In my mind, that's what just drives her over the edge, that she realizes that it was kind of all for naught, that she didn't really have to do it. And that's when she kind of can't face any of them anymore. And so she leaves, and I had to give her a way out. So, Aunt Faye was a really nice way to give her a way out, Aunt Faye's inheritance, because women didn't have those options then. They didn't have those choices, they stuck around.
Right. Yeah, you see, I absolutely see that in my family's history, the sticking around in this scenarios, like that World War II generation, you just don't leave. And yet, it was really frowned upon. And it's kind of unfortunate, obviously. All right. So, just making sure there's nothing else scrolling up here. Okay, no, I didn't miss anything. There's a lot of writing over there. So in one of your press releases or somewhere, I read that the descriptor of part of the book as morally complex. And I find that to be such a very, it really is, because you're putting in all of these just juicy things to have the characters wrestle over, and so of course the most morally complex thing is their initial decision, the two women in that moment, to do that. And I think you've done it in such a way that it's almost like, oh yeah, of course I do that. It makes perfect sense. And yet, no, right? So how did you, just from a writing craft standpoint and from a character development standpoint, you really did it. So we, the reader, were very sympathetic to that choice. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I really felt like that was
hard.
Brilliantly done.
Yeah, that was hard because I knew that what they were going to do. And it was hard because I had to spend the beginning part of the book kind of giving you the reasons why they wanted what they wanted. And I always say that Helen wanted a girl, but Rose needed a boy. I always distinguish because to me, Helen's was a want because she wanted it. She would have been fine without it, but Rose wasn't going to be fine. She really needed it. But that was a tricky thing to have the beginning of the book, kind of that setup where you get to know them and you see what it is that's driving those desires, without hitting the reader over the head with it. I couldn't make Helen just sit there and look at pictures of little girls and just like cry, I want a girl, I want a girl, I want a girl, I want a girl. Right. You have to give some sort of justification. And with Rose, it was important to show all of the aspects of that marriage and why it was that she felt that pressure to deliver for Mort, and really get into Mort's character too, to understand what a miserable person he was, his various disappointments, his dropping out of school, why he's bitter, all those things. But that was tricky. That was hard for me. And it took me a while and to get that right, to get that balance right without really like pounding the reader with it.
Yeah. So just from a craft perspective, how many, edits, rewrites did you have to do? Like, what's that process look like for you,
So, this was my first book and I hadn't written before. I started taking a class at Sarah Lawrence. I started taking a writing class because I had the story. I had no idea what I was doing at all. And I wrote this book over 5 years and I took that class for a lot of that time. I mean, it's kind of a very unstructured class and you just go around and read what you're working on and people critique. And so different years, there would be different people coming in and out of the class. There were certain people that stayed always. And I think it was kind of trial and error. I'm a very slow writer. I don't write and then revise and revise and revise. That's just not how I do it. I want it to be right. So I write a sentence and delete the sentence. And it can take me a day to write a paragraph. That's how I am. But once I like it, then I like it, and I feel like it's set. When I got to, when I found my agent and she went through the book, one of the things, just what we just talked about, she sent it out to someone to read and they wanted me to tone down that aspect of their desire. I want a girl, I want a boy. So I did tone that down a little bit. But then when it came to the editing phase, my editor didn't edit that much. She didn't have a heavy hand with it. There were certain things and they were all really smart things that she wanted me to do. But they were maybe like 4 or 5 bigger points, like scenes, that she wanted. And they made a lot of sense. One of them that I think is that people tend to find the most interesting was actually at the end when I originally wrote the story and Rose goes to Florida. I didn't revisit her at the end. And my editor very wisely said, I think we need to see her again. Like, we need some closure. We need some hope for her. Like, you can't just leave her right. Awful, hopeless situation. So that was interesting. And then that idea of her sending the earrings kind of came to me in the shower one day. Actually, that was like one of those that was a shower thought.
Love those shower moments.
Yeah, my shower moments, my driving in the car moments, that was a shower moment. But, for a while I was like, should Rose have a new boyfriend? Like, what should happen in Florida? I don't know.
Right. The earrings was a really,
that worked. That really worked. But I'm slow. I'm a slow writer. I'm a very slow writer.
Yeah.
That's just how I do it.
Okay. Slow and steady wins the race. That's what one of my husbands says. Yeah. Tortoise in the hare. That's his favorite story. So continuing on with sort of the morally complex aspect of things, they kept the secret for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
And, and it's interesting because I can't keep a secret I mean, I just can't, it's not in my DNA to keep a secret, even a small one. If I feel I've done something wrong, it eats at me, or, and you have these two very different personalities, who are very capable of keeping that secret. Now it ate at them and it did, but they did not, they didn't let it out until until one of them had to, years and years and years and years later. And wow.
People kept secrets then. I think it was a different time. And I think that there were a lot of family secrets. People didn't talk about things, even if it wasn't a true secret. There were all kinds of things that happened in families. This one married someone no one liked and nobody talked about them ever again. It was that time period. And I think that was a real thing. I think we have a lot less privacy now. We are all much more open now. We talk about our problems now in a way that people didn't then. Certainly, like even the postpartum depression, people didn't talk about that.
Right, they did not talk about it. It's true. You're so right about the secrets. I know now, family secrets from my grandparents of that generation, and you're like, what? How could that be?
Yeah.
And yet somebody knew the entire time. And they had it right there, and they just lived. And it's so foreign.
It's generational. That was how and you could keep a secret then. There wasn't social media. There was, you could keep a secret from people.
You could. It's true.
You could. It was easier.
Yeah, it was, and almost necessary in some cases. Not in this regard. They made a choice to keep it, but in sometimes I think it probably was just a necessary secret. So, what are you writing now?
I am writing about, I'm really excited about my book now. It has some secrets. It's about two sisters. And when the story opens up, they're estranged and they're being reunited after not seeing each other for 5 years. And it's really close to me because I mentioned at the beginning of our talk that I grew up in Massachusetts, and I grew up in Western Massachusetts, near Springfield in a little town called Longmeadow. And in Springfield, there was a place called the Springfield Armory, which I didn't even know about. And they never took us there on a field trip. I'm really angry. I feel like writing a letter to my school system. I'm just saying, why did you never take us to this place? But it was this really fascinating place that actually George Washington commissioned, and they made arms for the troops for a few hundred years. And during World War II, there were 13,000 people working there, and they made most of the rifles for the troops for World War II, or they were one of the biggest producers of rifles for the troops for World War II. You've heard of a Springfield rifle. A lot of people have heard of that. I really hate guns. So it's really bizarre to me that I'm writing this book about an armory, but it was a really interesting place. They hired a ton of women then. And the reason that I am setting it, the story was originally different. And one of the characters just had a very minor backstory that she had worked at the Springfield Armory. But even for a few paragraphs of a backstory, you need to do research. And when I started to research the Armory, it was just too rich and too interesting and too fascinating and there's so much history there. And I don't know, there were officers living there in these beautiful homes, and there were tennis courts and a swimming pool and these mansions. And then on the other side of the street were these factories, and there was this whole kind of class divide and just so many interesting juxtapositions. There were beautiful gardens there next to an underground ballistics testing tunnel. The beauty and the kind of horror, all kind of mixed together. So I just wanted it to take place there, really. So the sisters actually could have been neighbors of the characters in the two family house. They really could be. They're a family. They grow up in Brooklyn, and so it flashes back to Brooklyn. We still have Brooklyn because I feel like it's such a rich setting, and I love it. I just love to write about that time. It's a little bit earlier. It starts a little earlier, before World War II. But then things happen with these two sisters, and they don't talk to each other for 5 years. And when the story starts again, the younger one is going to live with the older one at the Springfield Armory and getting a job there because they were hiring all these women and she needed a job. And it's very tense between them in the beginning because of things that have happened before. And slowly you find out what those things are. But there are a lot of great characters. The people at the Armory, there's a museum there now. And so I've been visiting, and they're so terrific and helping me so much with the research. Mm-hmm. And it's just great. I don't know, it's just like a treasure trove of personalities and stuff that they have. One of the things that they did at the Armory was there were people that were writing an Armory newsletter to boost morale, and they would have these like employee spotlight kind of things. And so there were like, one of the things I read was this opera singer who worked in the cafeteria, so like I was like, that's the greatest character ever. Like, I need a character like that. So I have some really interesting kind of people that are in there. And it's the kind of working title is the Armory Sisters. And there are 2 sisters by birth, and then there are some sisters by choice kind of thing, some really close friends that find their way in there. So I'm excited about it. It's almost done. I'm working. Almost
done. Excellent.
Done. Yeah. So it should be winter of 2018.
Okay. We'll be looking for it, and we'll have to get another, do another interview, get you on TV. So there's another question here, and I was writing down something as you were talking, and it's sort of similar. And this one is, why do you write historical fiction? Is it coincidental that both of your stories now are that, or do you that's what you're drawn to? I write science fiction, so I have a really good reason for why I write that. And when some people ask me, I can say, so why do you write historical?
The first story was just the story, everyone gets their 15 minutes of fame and everybody has one good story in them, I think. Like, that was I hope that's not my only good story, but that was the story that I had to write. And it had to be in that time period just for a lot of reasons, Well,
The Secret wouldn't have worked.
I mean, first, and there would have been too much DNA testing, and people would have, wouldn't have worked. There would have been sonograms.
Yeah.
Would have had sonograms. The next one is interesting because it started out, like I said, as a different kind of story. And it actually started out as kind of a grandmother-granddaughter story instead of a sister story. And some of it, and it was flashing back, but some of it was set more in the present, more the 1980s. But when I write in modern settings, in anything from the 80s forward or whatever, I don't like how I sound. I just don't like it. I feel like I lose something. I'm not an edgy writer. I'm not a modern kind of writer. I'm very, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. I like looking back, and I like making sense of the past, and I like exploring it. There's a richness to that time period, the 30s, 40s, 50s, that just really speaks to me. I guess because, that was when my mother was growing up, and those were the stories that I heard as a child. And those are the stories I feel like I want to tell. I did try to write more modern, but I can't. It was terrible. Terrible.
You say that because I think there's something about voice, when you hold a voice and you're carrying it through an entire work, there's a certain comfort with it, or just a proficiency at it, and I wrote, a fantasy story, and I write science fiction, and my science fiction is, obviously it's more modernish, or futuristic, but I wrote a fantasy story because I was a classics major, and I set it back in the time of, the Odyssey.
Right.
And it was a very literary voice, which is different than and I really, if I were to try to write a whole book like that, I don't think I could. It's not my natural. It came out well, but it was such a labor intensive process for me. But that story needed to be with that tone and voice to work.
Right.
And so I think that's really interesting that we all have almost I don't know, just a thing we're drawn to, or a place we feel comfortable as writers. And you can stretch.
Yeah. There's a comfort there. There's a comfort level that I have, and the vocabulary that I like to use works. Yeah. It's not hard for me to write dialogue. It's hard for me to write modern dialogue. It's just awful. I don't like how I don't like the words. but the dialogue from that, it's just easier for me. It flows, and I feel like I have to. I feel like I kind of don't have a choice. Like I have to. Yeah.
Well, that makes total sense to me. And so the thing I was going to ask about, and you touched on it a little bit, is like, sometimes a place becomes almost like a character. And you're talking about the Armory in the new book, and that house had such a role. And I've read other books that, the place or, has this huge, center.
Yes.
And then you have to know it yourself, like the back of your hand, like to be able to walk through the rooms and see what's on the counter and then subtly put that in there so that the reader can see it. And you really did that. So was that house a real house from your childhood memory, or is it from stories that your family told, or did you make it up and fulfill it in your imagination,
It was a real house. It was a real house. So my mom grew up on Christopher Avenue in Brooklyn, New York. And I actually met some people who lived on Christopher Avenue in Brooklyn, New York. Like I use the name of the street in the book. I was never in the house, but I've seen pictures of the outside of the house, not really of the inside. But downstairs in that house was my grandmother's brother and his 3 daughters. So it was a family. It was a 2-family house, and it was all their, a brother and sister and their families. But it's funny because, the cover of the book is so pretty, and it has this like brownstone that's really beautiful and very pristine. And that was not how the house looked. It was a tiny brick facade. It was not a pretty house at all. It really is another character. I kind of call it a percolator. Like if they did not live in that house, the story could not have happened. It had to be in that house. And it was funny too, like with the cover and then even with the title, because when I wrote the story, my working title always was The 2-Family House, but I thought it was so boring and I really didn't want to use that title. And when I met my agent and she said, send it to me, send the whole thing to me, send me the manuscript, I wanted to give it a different title. I wanted it to be really snazzy, and like I wanted to give it this really cool. So I'm like racking my brains and I came up with this other title, which was taken from the poem that Faye, the Emily Dickinson poem that Faye quotes to Natalie, which is every grief I meet, measure every grief I meet. So I called the book, I sent it to the agent, called Every Grief I Meet, because there's so much grief in the story, and she said, the first thing she said to me was, we got to change that title.
Right.
Nobody wants a book. Nobody wants to read a novel with grief in the title. Like it sounds like a book on mourning. Like we can't have that title. And she said, what else do you have? What else do you, what are your other titles? And I said, I don't have any. It's a problem. I just have this really boring working title and it's just The 2-Family House. And she said, that's perfect. That's what it's about. That's it.
Right.
That's it.
The house is like you said, if without the house, this stuff wouldn't have, one wouldn't be up, they wouldn't be down, they wouldn't be, oops.
Yeah, it wouldn't work.
No, it wouldn't work. So, and I'm just going to say to, let's see, there's another question popping up. I was just going to say to the viewers that I'm going to ask one more question. We probably have one more time for one more from people. So, did your agent sell that manuscript quickly?
Well, in the grand scheme of things, yes. To me, it was really slow. She started sending it out like in September, and it sold in November. So it was 3 months. It was
that's great.
But they were like 3 very agonizing months. They were agony. But yeah.
But that's great. Congratulations. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
So my last question for you, and if anybody else has one more, they can post it now and I will get it there. But it's just sort of a, you're not lawyering anymore, so you're a full-time writer. I would assume that's what you define yourself as now. So I am too. And how does it work for you? Like, what's your day look like? How do you get it all done? And
every day is different, I mean, but I have to say, I feel really lucky because when I was a lawyer, I never really loved it. And I never really had that. I think this is why I say when I related to Judith, like I just had this idea that I was probably never going to really find that thing that I felt like I was meant to do. And that would be okay. And I would eventually, you know, I went back to law part-time a little bit here and there. I did some legal recruiting, and I figured like, that's just going to be what it's going to be, you know, like profession. I love my husband. I love my kids. I'm very lucky. So maybe professionally, I'm not going to have as much fulfillment as some people have. But then when this happened, I feel like it's what I'm supposed to do. And I feel so lucky that I get to do it. And I feel like all of it, like this part, like talking to you, all of it. I love all of it. I love every single bit of it, all of it. And I love that I'm in my husband's, like we have one office in my house. It's really my husband's office. Like I don't have a desk. I don't have an office. I just sit at my kitchen table, you know, and that's where I write. And I like that. Like, right. And I write every day, especially now because this second book has a deadline. I write every day. Some days are very productive. Some days I delete everything that I write. You know, some days I write a sentence and I'm thrilled because it's like the perfect sentence. And some days I don't like anything. Yeah, you know, it's just that way. My kids are older. So it used to be when I first started taking that class, you know, I would write more in the morning when they were at school. But now, you know, they have homework. They're busy. If my husband isn't home from work or whatever, I can write whenever. That's the only problem, is that I actually sometimes need to take a break and I don't, you know, because I feel like you could work every day and because I like it and it's not really work, you know.
Right.
So, but
it is, but it's not, you know.
It's still necessary to step away from it.
Sure.
But it's hard sometimes. And I think if you're a writer, and I'm sure you feel this way, I think if you're a writer, you're always half somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Because
my kids tell me all the time, Mom, stop, put down the computer, put down the notebook, put down the computer. I'm like, but I have this idea. I have to get it done right now. And of course, you know, and so that's the turning on off. I remember, you know, when I worked I worked at a school and you go to work in the morning, you do your work there and you take some of it home with you, of course, because that's the nature of being good at what you do and an accountable person. But you really did leave, you know, there was that place for that and there's a place for this. And now it's just, this is, and it could be all the time for sure.
Right. It really could be.
And so my very last question for you is just as just writer to writer, do you ever have that moment where you're like, oh no, I have to rip the whole thing apart and start, it's just, oh no, it's uh-oh. Because I've had it both times with both my books and both and all of the short stories that I've written. I've had that moment of complete and utter panic that it's not going to come together, or I'm going to have to edit it apart and I'm not going to be able to reassemble it, you know? And
yeah, I mean, yeah, I did have that moment with the first iteration of this book where it was that other story and I was right. Like I had to, with this story, I was panicking until I reached sort of a critical mass. And then I really knew where it was and it was coming together and the themes were coming together. And now I know that it's the story that it's supposed to be. So I'm not worried now. I mean, I'm worried. Yeah. I hope that when it's done, I mean, my agent has read the first half of it. I hope that she likes the second half the way she liked the first half. And I hope that my editor is happy with it. You know, of course I'm worried about that, but I'm happy with it now. I am. Like, I'm pretty decisive. I'm very indecisive until I'm decisive. And then once I've made up my mind, then I'm good. So I'm at that point now with it. So now I think I'm good.
Yeah, it's good to get to that point where you sort of know, all right, now I know I've got the right story. I know I have, you know, I solved the plot tangles in my mind. Now I just have to finish, you know, and that's such a good feeling. But
yeah.
Thank you so much. I feel like we're coming up on an hour, so I think I should probably let you go to bed.
Thank you so much for talking to me, and thank you to everybody who's listening for typing in your questions and stuff. That was great.
Yes, they did. But we had quite a little lineup over there on the side of questions. So this will be posted on our page, I believe, by tomorrow. It was streaming live, so there'll be lots and lots of people that'll be checking in, and hopefully you'll get some new readers and fans. And I am so looking forward to the new book. So hit me up when it's coming out, and we'll
get you an early one.
Viewers, my Kristen, who's monitoring us, said we have 100 viewers tonight.
That's terrific. Wow. Hi, everyone.
All right. Well, you have a good night. It was a pleasure.
All right. All right. Bye, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Okay, bye.